Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Chapter 10 lecture. So, before we talked about um, how under certain assumptions, the free market outcome is efficient. We talked about with good information, with price-taking behavior, and with no externalities, the level of output that's achieved in the free market maximizes societal well-being from that market. We learned that in the free market, we produce all those units that are more beneficial than they are costly, and we don't produce beyond that point. Beyond that point, we devote our resources to the production of some other good. That's good. That's what we want. That's why we want to rely on free markets as a baseline. But now in this chapter on externalities, we're going to relax one of those assumptions. We're going to assume that there are external costs or external benefits associated with some economic activity. Again, an externality is just when the actions of one economic agent affect the utility or the well-being or the productivity of another economic agent directly. The first example we're going to use is pollution. We're going to assume that we're producing some good, whatever. It could be bicycles, it could be basketballs, whatever, it doesn't matter. But the production of that good carries with it pollution. And so producing this good creates negative outcomes for other people in the economy who aren't even part of this market, right? I have a basketball factory. If I'm emitting toxic emissions in the air, then people downwind of me are going to be directly impacted by my economic activity. That's what an externality is. We start with this chapter when we start to relax these assumptions of efficient markets. We start with this topic because externalities are so common. They're all over the place. And, it's not hard to look around and find examples of external costs or external benefits. So let's go to screen share. Let's get right to it. Here is our regular, supply and demand figure, just like always. We're going to call this quantity that emerges in the free market, we're just going to call this the free market quantity here. Just, that's the same quantity we've been saying before, but I'm just saying that is the level of activity that the free market achieves on its own. Our first example is going to be a negative externality. Right? We can have positive or negative externalities, but we're going to start with an example of a negative one. And we're going to say it's a production externality because it's associated with the production of some good. Here we're going to say specifically the example is pollution. Pollution is such a common example, it's really easy to start there. So here's, demand. It's, derived from marginal value. We're going to say more specifically now that demand is derived from private marginal value. That doesn't really matter here in this case, but it's the marginal value that consumers receive privately on their own. Same thing here, we're going to, I'll just remind you that supply is derived from marginal cost, but here we're going to say it's derived from private marginal cost. It is derived from the marginal cost that the firm faces when they're producing whatever good that it is that we're talking about. But now the key in this example is there are other costs, right? Associated with this good, there are other costs out there that we're not accounting for in the market, right? Consumers are just looking at their own benefits that they receive directly. Producers are just looking at their own benefits that they incurred, or producers are just looking at their own costs that they incur directly. We have this other cost out there in the form of pollution that nobody's paying attention to. Here we're going to assume that just for every unit of production, there is just a flat additional external cost associated with that unit of production. I could draw it on here, but I'm not going to bother to draw it just to keep the figure clean. But when we're judging whether this market is good or bad, we want to look at total cost. We don't want to look at just private cost and ignore that external cost. I mean, as analysts of this market, we want to look at the full picture. We want to consider all of the costs. So what we're going to do is we're going to add all the costs together. That doesn't sound like that radical of a notion. We're going to do this. we're just going to add the external cost on top of the private marginal cost. This curve will become not private marginal cost, but it will become total marginal cost, or we'll call it social marginal cost. Social marginal cost. And the distance between these two marginal cost curves is just the amount of the external cost. It's just simply the amount of the external cost. Here we're assuming, I mean, my figure looks kind of cheesy, but we're assuming that the marginal cost is constant for every unit of output. So if this were drawn properly, then the distance between those two curves would be the same all across, but it looks like it's not quite the same because my drawing is pretty funky. So now the question becomes, how much do we want to produce, right? If we just want to, maximize total well-being in society, how much do we want to produce? Do we want to produce the first unit? Well, here I'll use this pointer. Here's the benefit of the first unit. Here's the true cost of the first unit. Even after accounting for this marginal cost, the first unit is still more valuable than it is costly. Sure, we want to produce that first unit. Second unit, more valuable than it is costly. Sure, we want to produce that second unit. Up until this point, at this point, this is where true marginal cost equals true marginal value. This is the efficient level of output. Right? We use the same logic here that we used before in terms of looking at, marginal cost equals marginal value. But here we're having to be careful to look at true marginal cost, because private marginal cost wasn't reflective of the full situation because of the externality. That's the whole point. So this quantity, we're going to call this Q effic, because this is the efficient level of output. So what do we see here? Before, with no external cost and no external benefits, the free market quantity was the efficient level of output, and that was super cool. But now what we're finding is the level of output achieved in the free market is actually too much. So the free market produces too much. It produces too much with a negative external cost. Just think about it this way. For this first unit, beyond Q effic, the unit is more valuable than it is costly. Let's do this in red. The unit is more valuable than it is costly by that much, right? Just look at this first unit past Q effic. Here's the true cost. Here's the true benefit. It costs us more as a society to produce this unit than it's worth to us. That's the same for the second unit. It's the same for the third unit. It's the same for all these units between Q effic and the free market level of output. This triangle, guess what it is? You guessed it. We talked about it before. This is the dead weight loss. This represents the overall loss to society because we're producing too much in the free market, because in the free market, we're not considering that external cost, right? Private agents in the free market are just looking at their own costs and benefits. They're just looking at this regular demand curve. They're just looking at this regular supply curve. End of story. That's all there is to it. They're responding to regular market incentives. Those regular incentives produce the free market level of output, but with this negative external cost, they're not looking at true cost. The result is overproduction, and the dead weight loss triangle reflects the overall loss to society as a result of this overproduction. That's a bummer. This is what we call, this is an important term, this is what we call market failure. Be sure to know that term. We're certainly going to talk more about that term, market failure. With good information, with price-taking behavior, with no externalities, the free market achieves the efficient level of output. But here in this example, because we have a negative external cost, the free market fails to achieve the efficient level of output, thus the term market failure. Okay? That's a pretty straightforward example. We'll go through another example just for fun. This is so much fun. Second example we'll go through will be a negative consumption externality. The example that I give here is cigarette smoke. Cigarettes are not nearly as common as they used to be. When I was a kid, I feel like people were going around smoking all the time, but now it's less common. This might be an old example, but whatever, I'm going to go along with it anyway. There's the demand curve, which is the private marginal value curve. Here's the supply curve, the private marginal cost curve. Here we're still talking about, well, sorry, there is the free market level of output. Here, we're still talking about a negative externality, but here it's a consumption externality. It's associated with the consumption of the good, not the production of the good. So right, when you're consuming cigarettes, you have your own private marginal value, but that secondhand smoke that just floats around and, you know, disturbs people at the doorway or on the sidewalk or wherever you're smoking, that creates a negative cost that those people have to incur. It's an external cost. It's above and beyond the benefits of the cost that you receive from buying cigarettes or consuming cigarettes. It's an external cost that's affecting third parties. So here it's not on the supply side, it's consumption externality. So we're going to think about this as being on the demand side. We have this marginal external cost associated with every cigarette that's being produced. How we're going to conceptualize this is, let me change colors here. We're going to subtract off the amount of the negative externality from the private marginal value curve, right? This demand curve represents the marginal value that the consumer receives, but we're going to subtract from that external cost. So this will become the social marginal value, which is obviously less than the private marginal value. And again, the distance between the vertical distance between these two is the amount of the externality. Now that's the same thing as before, same way we did it before. So this becomes the efficient level of output, or the efficient level of consumption, right? All these units below Q official are more valuable than they are costly. Those units should be consumed. But this first unit beyond Q offish, here's the cost, here's the value. We lose that much in overall value to society for consuming too much. Look at all the units between the efficient level of output and the free market level of output. Look at the difference for all those units between, true marginal cost and true marginal value. And what you get is this new triangle. That's the deadweight loss triangle in this case. Because we're over consuming, society is worse off by that amount because the free market is failing to achieve the efficient level of output. Bummer. Let's go on to another example. This is so good, we'll just work with a third example. So there's a supply, private marginal cost, demand, private marginal value. There's the free market. Here I'm going to skip over example number 3 in my notes. I'm just going to skip straight to number 4. I'm going to let you do number 3 on your own for extra practice. Number 3 is done using the exact same logic that we've done with 1 and 2 and that we will do with 4. So you should be able to fill in 3 just fine on your own. Here we're going to look at the example of a positive consumption externality. So here it's on the consumption side still, it's going to affect the demand side of the market. But now here we're talking about a positive externality. So people are actually being benefited as a result of my consumption of a product. The classic example here is flu shots. I take a flu shot. That helps me, obviously. It helps me avoid the flu. That's reflected in my normal demand curve. That's reflected in my normal marginal value curve. But there's this other benefit that's created for other people in society. If I'm less likely to have the flu, then that's going to reduce the likelihood that people will catch the flu around me. So those people are being benefited by my consumption of flu shots. So what we do here, let's do this in green. This becomes a social marginal value curve. We're just adding vertically, right? We take this, for this unit, let me stretch this out just a little bit. For this unit, here's the marginal value to me of consuming the flu shot. But we just add on to that the extra value that people get around me because they're less likely to get the flu. So here's the amount of the externality. Now, here obviously social marginal value is higher than private marginal value because we're adding in that extra benefit. This point becomes the efficient level of flu shot consumption in this case. So to look at the issue here, right, for all these units up until this point, let me use this pointer, for all these units up till this point, look, their value is more than their cost. But we're only consuming this many units. For this first unit beyond Q free market, that unit is more valuable than it is costly by that amount. It's more valuable than it is costly by that amount, but we're just simply not enjoying that net benefit because we're not consuming enough flu shots. For all these units between Q efficient and Q free market, we're just not getting that benefit. We're not consuming enough flu shots. So all this potential surplus to society is just not happening, right? This is what we call the dead weight loss. Although in some sense, I kind of feel weird about calling it a loss in this case because it's never realized. What I like to think of it is, sometimes I like to think of it as foregone benefits. That's additional benefits that we could enjoy as a society, but those benefits are just simply not happening. Those benefits aren't existing because because we're not consuming enough of the unit, because private individuals aren't accounting for this extra benefit that's associated with their flu shot consumption. They're not incorporating that into their decision making. We're just simply foregoing those additional benefits. The free market underproduces or underconsumes in this case when we have a positive externality. In the previous two examples, the free market overproduced or overconsumed with a negative externality. Here with a positive externality, we're underconsuming because we're not accounting for that positive benefit that's created. So this is your first example. I hope this is straightforward enough. I've gone through this quickly, but again, you can rewatch it, you can pause it, you can go home and explain it to your roommate, which you definitely should do and be a dork just like me. But I've gone through it quickly, but hopefully this makes sense. All you have to do is just understand what kind of externality you're talking about. Is the externality positive or negative, or is it on the consumption side or on the production side? And just simply kind of adjust that private marginal value or that private marginal cost curve to account for the external cost or the external benefit. If you do that, that will give you social marginal value or social marginal cost. And that's your true cost or your true value. That's what you have to really focus on. That's what you should focus on. And then determine the efficient level of output just by looking at that true cost or value curve. And then you can just follow from that and get the, you can just follow from that to get the efficient level of output. Now in our book, not in our book, but well, actually it's in our book, but I'm looking at my notes. In the notes, you see we have this term you have this term, internalize the externality. The problem with the externality is that private economic agents, whether they be consumers or producers, are not considering the external cost or the external benefit that exists. They just don't consider that. They're not paying attention to that. They're not looking at that. But we want to make them internalize that externality. We want people to actually realize all those costs or all those benefits associated with their activities. We want all those costs and benefits to be realized, to be internalized, to be responded to achieve the efficient outcome. Now, in my notes, I'm going to make this a little bit briefer because I think these YouTube videos are a little bit harder to watch than if we were having this as a real discussion in class. In my book, you see where in my notes, you see where I talk about the Coase theorem. I'm just going to skip over the Coase theorem for now. We're not going to worry about that. But I would encourage you to read that and understand that on your own. The Coase theorem is really interesting. It's discussed in the Mankiw textbook. I think it's a good discussion. Read that, understand that. And the Coase theorem is really interesting, really important, and it really helps us understand a lot more about the economy. I mean, the guy won a Nobel Prize for his work, you know, that's encapsulated in what we call the Coase theorem and other stuff that he did as well. But I'm going to skip over that, and I'm just going to assume that, you know, we have external benefits, we have external costs, and we are not able to reach kind of a private sector solution where affected parties just negotiate on their own and achieve an efficient outcome. So we're going to talk about public sector. Public sector solutions. Ooh, that looks so rough, but that says public sector solutions. We're going to talk about when government intervention may be warranted to actually affect the free market outcome. You see where I'm coming from here? When we don't have externalities and when those other assumptions we discussed earlier hold, then the free market works on its own. And we don't really need government to affect how much the free market produces or consumes of some good. We don't need government, right? The free market works on its own under those assumptions. But here, where we, you know, where those assumptions don't hold, where we have external costs or external benefits, if we're not able to achieve a private sector solution, which is discussed in the Coase section, then government intervention may be warranted to actually achieve an efficient outcome. So let's do this. There's our original setup. We're going to go back to the example, the first example we went through. I could just flip back to the same figure, but I'm not going to. Let's go back to that first example of a negative production externality. In this case, we have this marginal external cost, and we add that marginal external cost to the private marginal cost to get the social marginal cost, right? Private marginal cost plus the external cost is equal to this social marginal cost, which we've just added to the supply curve. And we've already demonstrated how this Q-effic, we've demonstrated how that is the efficient level of output. One of the classic examples here is called a Pigouvian tax, named after this famous economist from a long, long time ago named Arthur Cecil Pigou. This is what we would do. We would come and we would levy a tax on these producers that's equal to the external cost. If the external cost is $1 per unit of output, we would simply levy a tax. You pay you pay a tax to the government equal to $1 per unit of output. And go back now, if you've forgotten, go back to the tax video and watch what we said about how a tax would affect the supply curve, right? The tax just, it becomes part of the marginal cost, right? When it's levied on sellers, it becomes part of the marginal cost. This social marginal cost curve would be equal to the supply curve with the tax, right? This distance is equal to the externality, right? This distance between the private marginal cost curve and the social marginal cost curve is equal to the externality, and we could just make that equal to T. We could make that equal to the tax. If we do that, the social marginal cost curve would become the new supply curve. The new supply curve once the tax is levied. And then that would become the supply curve that sellers would actually pay attention to, because they would be seeing that tax, right? That tax, which would be reflective of the external cost to begin with, they would be seeing that tax. The tax would essentially internalize the externality. Does that make sense? We want to internalize the externality, but by levying a tax on producers, that's equal to the externality, that would effectively internalize the externality. And this level of output here would become the free market level of output with the tax. This is called a Pigouvian tax. It's also called a corrective. It's also called a corrective tax because it corrects for that market failure. Okay? A Pigouvian tax or a corrective tax. It corrects for the market failure. And this is also what we call, you see this in my notes. I'm going to stop screen share because I think that's the end of my writing here. But, oh geez, I forgot what I was saying. This is also called the price approach. We're talking about the price approach to correcting for externalities. In this case, we're going in and we're levying a tax, and that essentially affects the market price, and we are achieving the efficient level of output through the price mechanism. And this is an example of a really cool tax, actually. Most taxes, as we said back before when we gave the tax example kind of in a standalone sense, most taxes are efficient, most taxes are inefficient. When we levy a tax in a free market environment, that's going to reduce overall well-being in society. We showed before what the dead weight loss of a tax looks like when it's levied in a context, where we don't have market failure to begin with. The tax itself creates poor economic outcomes. It creates dead weight loss itself. But in this case, where we have an externality where we're producing too much to begin with, the tax actually improves the outcome, and the tax is actually a good thing, not a bad thing. So kind of the first place that you want to go when you're trying to raise revenue for government to fund public goods, which are kind of their own discussion, the first place you want to go to is corrective taxation. Because with corrective taxation, it's not really about minimizing losses. That's what we said before when we were working on taxes. We want to design a tax system such that we minimize losses. That's not the case here, because a tax in this case, a Pigouvian tax, is actually improving economic outcomes. It's actually creating gains for society. So that's fantastic. That's cool. The other approach is just simply called the regulation approach. Here the government is coming in and engineering the efficient level of output through affecting the price mechanism. The regulation approach is just when government comes in and just mandates, this is the quantity that you produce. It's illegal to produce it's illegal to produce more than this amount. That's all there is to it, nothing else. So that's the example of a negative externality. Go through on your own. You have a diagram in your book and you have space in my notes for a positive externality. With a positive externality, we could also intervene through the price mechanism by levying a subsidy, right? We want to tax something that creates negative outcomes, but we want to subsidize something that creates positive external outcomes, like flu shots, right? We subsidize flu shots, for example. So go through on your own for extra practice. I don't want you to just watch me draw these figures. I want you to draw some of these figures on your own, draw some of these figures for your roommate. That will help get you extra practice. That will help you learn the material better. So go through the positive externality example and show the subsidy amount and how the subsidy could achieve the efficient level of output. Does that make sense? I think that's all for now. We'll have some more discussion points on this. This is an important discussion, important lecture. We have more to discuss, but I think I'll leave that for the Zoom discussion. But what you've heard right now is the basics of the externality chapter, and you know how to incorporate externalities into the supply and demand model. You know how to understand, you know how to use that supply and demand model to understand outcomes associated with externalities. So I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.